Here's a scene that probably feels familiar. A mother gets a text from her adult son, a photo of his dog, a thumbs-up emoji on something she sent last week, a miss you, been crazy busy, that arrives at 11 p.m. and gets answered the next morning with a heart reaction. On paper, that's contact. There was an exchange. Nobody went silent. And yet, if you ask that mother honestly, at the end of a week built entirely out of moments like that, whether she feels close to her son right now, in this season of both their lives, I think a lot of you already know what the honest answer would be. Not really. Something is technically happening, and almost nothing is actually happening. That gap between contact and closeness, between being in touch and actually being together, is what I want to spend this entire video on, because a philosopher who lived 2,400 years ago, long before anyone had a phone at all, already worked out exactly why that gap exists and exactly what it takes to close it. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand something concrete about why digital contact with your child can leave you feeling more alone, not less, and what to actually do about it that doesn't require your child to change first. I want to start with Aristotle, because I think his work on friendship, which he takes up at real length in the Nicomachean Ethics, gives us the sharpest possible lens for understanding what's actually missing when contact doesn't produce closeness. Aristotle divides friendship, or what the Greeks called philia, into three categories. There's friendship of utility, bonds that exist because each person is useful to the other, like a working relationship. There's friendship of pleasure, bonds built around enjoying someone's company, having fun together, the kind of friendship common among the young in Aristotle's account. And then there's the category he considers the deepest and rarest, friendship of virtue, or what's sometimes translated as complete friendship, a bond where each person wishes the other well for the other's own sake, not for what they provide, and where the relationship itself, not any specific benefit flowing from it, is the actual point. Here's the detail from Aristotle's account that I think almost nobody brings into conversations about modern digital communication, and it's the one I want to build this entire episode around. Aristotle argues that this deepest form of friendship absolutely requires what he calls Syzein, a word usually translated as living together, or more precisely, spending time together, sharing daily life, being physically present to one another over extended periods. He's explicit that friendship of this depth cannot form and cannot be sustained purely through goodwill or good feeling held at a distance. It requires actual shared time, actual shared presence, activities done together rather than merely reported to each other afterward. I think this is the exact mechanism explaining why a week full of texts can leave you feeling further from your child rather than closer. Aristotle would say the texts aren't friendship of virtue's substance. They're, at best, a kind of goodwill transmitted at a distance, closer to a signal that the deeper bond still technically exists, without any of the actual shared presence that bond depends on to stay alive and growing rather than just preserved in amber. I want to bring this into the world of the Stoics too, because we've spent a lot of time on this channel with Seneca, and his letters actually address this almost directly in a context that maps eerily well onto our current situation. Seneca, in his letters to his friend Lucilius, writes about the value of a letter itself. Remember, in his world, a letter was the equivalent of our text message, the fastest available form of long-distance contact. And Seneca actually defends letters as valuable, more valuable than people often assume, because he says a friend's letter carries something of their actual presence, their actual voice, if it's written with real attention and honesty rather than mere formality. But, and this is the detail I think matters most for this episode, Seneca is also explicit that letters are a supplement to presence, not a replacement for it. He describes actual, physical time together as carrying something letters cannot fully substitute, what he calls in various translations, the living voice and intimacy of a person actually present, something transmitted through tone, through unplanned moments, through the accumulated texture of shared time that a letter, however well written, can only gesture toward rather than actually provide. So here's where I want to bring ancient wisdom and modern research together, because I think they're describing the exact same phenomenon from two different centuries. Sherry Turkle, a psychologist and sociologist at MIT who has spent decades studying how digital communication changes relationships, wrote a book called Reclaiming Conversation that I think functions almost like a modern footnote to Aristotle's Syzein. Turkle's research draws a sharp distinction between what she calls connection and what she calls conversation. Connection, in her framework, is the constant, low-effort contact digital tools make possible. Texts, likes, quick replies, the modern equivalent of Seneca's letters, except far more frequent and far less considered. Conversation, by contrast, is something slower, something that requires actual, undivided attention, actual vulnerability, actual real-time responsiveness that can't be edited, delayed, or curated the way a text message can be. Turkle's research found something specific and, I think, genuinely important for families dealing with this exact issue. Constant low-effort connection doesn't just fail to build the deeper kind of closeness. It can actively substitute for it, in a way that leaves both people feeling like enough contact has happened, when the kind of contact capable of building or sustaining Aristotle's friendship of virtue never actually occurred. Turkle calls this the illusion of companionship without the demands of real intimacy. Connection that feels, moment to moment, like enough, precisely because it's frequent, while actually leaving the underlying relationship thinner over time, not thicker. I think this explains something a lot of parents feel but rarely have language for. The sense that you're in more contact with your child than you've ever been, technically, and yet somehow further away than you used to be, back when contact was rarer but built entirely out of actual shared time. A weekly dinner, a long phone call with nothing else happening, a visit with no screens in the room. More frequent, thinner contact was quietly replacing less frequent, thicker contact, and almost nobody consciously chose that trade. It simply happened, the way most technological shifts happen, gradually enough that nobody had a moment of deciding it was worth it. I want to bring in one more piece of research here, because I think it adds something Aristotle and Seneca couldn't have anticipated, and it directly concerns the parent-child relationship specifically, rather than friendship in general. A body of research on what's sometimes called digital solidarity between older parents and their adult children has found that digital contact doesn't function as a single, uniform thing. It splits into distinct patterns, some of which genuinely sustain closeness, and some of which function more like Turkle's illusion of companionship. Researchers studying this have identified different types of digitally mediated family relationships, ranging from what you might call genuinely connected, where digital tools are used to deepen an already substantively engaged relationship, to what you might call distantly polite, where digital contact exists mostly to maintain a minimum viable signal that the relationship hasn't ended, without much real closeness flowing through it at all. The distinguishing factor across this research isn't the amount of digital contact. Some of the most distant relationships in these studies still involved frequent texting. The distinguishing factor is closer to what Aristotle would recognize immediately, whether the digital contact is oriented around actual shared attention, a real conversation, a video call where both people are actually present and undistracted, a shared plan for an actual visit, or whether it functions as a kind of relationship-shaped placeholder, present often enough to avoid guilt or worry on either side, without ever accumulating into the kind of Syzein, the kind of genuinely shared time, that Aristotle argued deeper closeness actually requires. So let's make this practical, because I think this is exactly the kind of episode that needs to end somewhere usable, not just somewhere true. If Aristotle, Seneca, and Turkle are all pointing at the same underlying mechanism. That closeness requires actual shared presence and attention, and that low-effort, high-frequency contact can quietly substitute for that without either person noticing the substitution happening. What does that actually suggest you do differently in your own relationship with your child? The first shift is recognizing that the goal isn't more contact. A lot of parents, feeling the distance, respond by texting more, checking in more often, sending more articles, more photos, more thinking of you messages, which, according to everything we've just covered, can actually deepen the exact problem it's trying to solve by reinforcing the pattern of frequent, thin contact, standing in for rare, thick contact. The more useful move, based on Aristotle's framework specifically, is asking not how often are we in touch, but when we are in touch, is anything like Syzein actually happening? Real shared attention, not just an exchange of signals that we still exist to each other. The second shift is being honest about what a text message can and can't do, in the spirit of Seneca's own honesty about letters. A text is genuinely valuable. It's not nothing, and Seneca himself wouldn't have wanted us to dismiss it. But it works best as what he intended letters to be. A supplement that carries real presence when it's written with real attention, not a replacement for actual shared time. If you notice a pattern where texting has quietly become the entire relationship, rather than a bridge between periods of actual shared time, that's worth naming honestly, both to yourself and, where it's possible, in a real conversation with your child, framed not as a complaint about them, but as your own honest observation about what you've noticed you actually need. The third shift, and I think this is the one drawn most directly from Turkle's research, is protecting whatever real-time contact you do have from the very tools that are otherwise so useful. A phone call where both people are also scrolling something else, a video call interrupted repeatedly by notifications, a visit spent mostly on separate screens in the same room. Turkle's research suggests these don't actually function as the deeper kind of contact they resemble on the surface. They're connection-wearing conversations clothing. If you get an hour of real-time contact with your child, protecting that hour from digital interruption on both sides matters more than the hour's length. Even a short amount of Aristotle's Syzein, genuinely present and undistracted, appears to do more for actual closeness than a much longer stretch of half-attentive contact. I want to end with something that I think ties all three of these thinkers together, separated by 24 centuries, and yet somehow converging on the exact same insight. None of them, not Aristotle, not Seneca, not Turkle, are arguing against digital contact or telling you texting is worthless. They're making a more precise claim, and I think it's the single most useful idea in this entire episode. Frequency and depth are not the same axis. You can increase one without increasing the other at all, and in fact, chasing frequency as a substitute for depth is one of the most common, least examined mistakes families make in exactly the kind of distance this channel keeps circling back to. What actually rebuilds closeness isn't more signals that the relationship still exists. It's actual shared time, however brief, given the kind of full, undivided attention that even Aristotle, writing before anything resembling a phone existed, already understood was the real substance closeness is made of. If this helped you see why your relationship with your child can feel both constantly in touch and quietly distant at the same time, that's exactly the kind of gap this channel exists to name and help you close. The third voice is here to keep bringing you this kind of clarity, so if this landed, subscribe, because there's more of this ground still ahead of us. Next time, we're going to look at the flip side of this exact issue. How to actually ask an adult child for more real, undistracted time together without it landing as pressure or guilt, and the specific language that tends to make that ask land as an invitation instead. That's next time here on The Third Voice.